December 18, 1978, 6:17 in the morning. Inside a small one-bedroom apartment in Ozone Park, Queens. Parnell Stax Edwards sat at his kitchen table, quietly playing cards. The apartment was silent. Then suddenly, the front door burst open. Two men rushed inside. Before Stax could react, one of them stepped forward. It was Tommy DeSimone. He pulled out a .38 revolver and fired several shots. Within seconds, Edwards collapsed at the table. The entire incident lasted only moments. It was the first killing connected to the famous Lufthansa robbery, and it would not be the last. Stax Edwards had made one critical mistake. After the robbery, he failed to get rid of the getaway van. For Jimmy Burke, mistakes like that were unacceptable. Burke was the planner behind the Lufthansa airport robbery, which at the time became the largest cash theft in American history. Nearly $6 million had been taken. But the truth is something many movies never fully explain. Jimmy Burke did not suddenly become violent because of the robbery. His reputation for extreme actions had already been established long before the heist happened. The robbery simply created a situation where he began removing anyone he believed could become a problem. And in Burke's world, people often became problems. This is the story of how Jimmy the Gent Burke became one of the most feared figures connected to organized crime in America. His path started with a troubled childhood, moved through years of street crime, and eventually led to leadership of the crew operating out of Robert's Lounge in Queens. From hijacked cargo trucks to the fallout of the Lufthansa robbery, Burke built a reputation that even hardened criminals respected and feared. But many details of his early life are rarely discussed. James Burke was born on July 5, 1931, in New York City. His mother, Jane Conway, was an Irish immigrant struggling to survive. When Burke was still very young, she left him behind. Burke never knew who his father was. That early abandonment shaped much of his life. At just 2 years old, Burke entered the foster care system in New York. Over the next decade, he moved from one home to another. Some families treated him kindly, but many environments were unstable and harsh. During those years, Burke experienced constant hardship. Discipline was often strict, and conflict was common. As a result, he grew up learning to rely only on himself. By the age of 10, he had already begun stealing small items. By 12, he was frequently getting into fights. Life had taught him that toughness was often the only way to survive. When he was 14, an argument with a foster parent turned violent. During the struggle, the man died. Authorities later ruled the incident as self-defense. After that event, Burke left the foster system and never returned. He began living on the streets of Brooklyn, surviving however he could. Small thefts and street fights became part of daily life. Before turning 16, he had already been arrested several times for minor crimes. But Burke was also intelligent and observant. He learned how neighborhoods worked and how different groups operated. Being Irish in largely Italian areas created a unique position for him. Since only Italians could officially join the Mafia, Burke could not become a formal member. However, this also meant he was not bound by the same internal rules. He could take risks others could not. In 1949, at 18 years old, Burke was sentenced to 5 years in prison for robbery. He served his time at Auburn Correctional Facility in upstate New York. That prison sentence would change his life. While there, Burke met Paul Vario, a powerful member of the Lucchese crime family. The two developed a strong connection during their time inside. When they were both released, Vario invited Burke to work with his crew. Burke was 25 years old, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Paul Vario controlled many criminal operations across Brooklyn and Queens. His organization specialized in hijacking cargo trucks leaving JFK Airport, running gambling operations, lending money at high interest, and selling stolen goods. Vario reported directly to leaders of the Lucchese family and carried significant influence. But he also faced a challenge. Law enforcement closely monitored official Mafia members. Their movements were often tracked, making it harder to run operations quietly. Vario needed someone outside the official structure, someone capable, loyal, and willing to take risks. Jimmy Burke was the perfect choice. In 1956, Burke opened a bar called Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary neighborhood bar, but behind the scenes, it became the center of many of the crew's activities. From that location, Burke and Vario's team organized cargo thefts, controlled street operations, and built one of the most active criminal groups in New York at the time. And this was only the beginning.
2 days after the robbery, police located the abandoned van. Inside, investigators discovered fingerprints belonging to Stax Edwards. That single mistake gave federal agents their first real lead. When Jimmy Burke heard the news on December 17, he did not explode with anger. He stayed calm and made a quiet phone call. The following morning, 2 men from Burke's crew, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe, went to Edwards' apartment. Moments later, Edwards was dead. He was only 28 years old and had worked with Burke's crew for 6 years. But to Burke, the abandoned van was more than a mistake. It was a risk that could expose everything. And that was only the beginning. Another man connected to the robbery soon became a problem. Martin Krugman owned a wig shop and worked as a bookmaker on the side. He was the person who first told Burke about the opportunity at the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Krugman had connections at the airport and introduced Burke to Louis Werner, the employee who later became the inside source. Burke promised Krugman $500,000 for the information. Krugman never received the money. By early January 1979, he was openly complaining to friends that Burke still owed him his share. Worse, he began threatening to go to the police. Burke quickly heard about the complaints. On January 6, 1979, Krugman disappeared. According to later testimony from Henry Hill, Burke and Angelo Sepe picked up Krugman from his shop and drove him to a warehouse in Brooklyn. He was never seen again. His wife reported him missing, but investigators found no physical evidence. To this day, Krugman's body has never been recovered. Only 10 days later, another conflict turned deadly. Richard Eaton, a drug dealer, had been supplying narcotics to members of Burke's crew, but in late 1978, Burke believed Eaton had cheated them during a large deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Instead of confronting him immediately, Burke waited. On January 17, 1979, Eaton was invited to Robert's Lounge to settle the dispute. He arrived around 9 in the evening. Inside the bar, Burke was waiting. Eaton never left. Later that night, Burke and Henry Hill transported the body to a construction site in Brooklyn and buried it beneath freshly poured concrete. The remains were discovered several years later during construction work. By that time, Burke was already in prison for other crimes. In 1985, Henry Hill testified about the incident during Burke's trial. Burke was eventually convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life. That conviction would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But in early 1979, Burke's campaign of silence was still unfolding. Teresa Ferrara, the girlfriend of Tommy DeSimone, also knew details about the Lufthansa robbery and the money involved. According to reports, she began talking about it to friends. When Burke learned about this, he acted quickly. On February 10, 1979, Ferrara disappeared. 10 days later, her body was discovered in Brooklyn. Investigators suspected Burke's involvement, but once again they had no proof. Ferrara was only 25 years old. Soon after, another shocking disappearance occurred. Tommy DeSimone, the same man who had carried out several violent jobs for Burke, suddenly vanished. DeSimone had been one of Burke's most trusted associates, but he had also made a dangerous mistake. Years earlier, he had killed a member connected to the powerful Gambino crime family without approval. In organized crime, killing a made member without permission was a serious violation. The Gambino family demanded revenge. Burke could not protect him. In January 1979, DeSimone was told he would be officially welcomed into the Lucchese crime family, but the ceremony was a trap. When he arrived at the meeting location, armed men were waiting. DeSimone was killed and secretly buried. His body has never been found. According to Henry Hill, Burke was deeply upset when he heard the news. DeSimone had been like a son to him. But loyalty inside Burke's world only went so far. Just weeks later, Burke ordered the killing of DeSimone's girlfriend, Teresa Ferrara, because she knew too much. By March 1979, 6 people connected to the Lufthansa robbery were either dead or missing. The FBI strongly suspected Burke was responsible. Agents watched him closely and monitored his movements, but they could not prove anything. Burke had removed witnesses and erased evidence. But the chain of events was not finished. Another member of the crew, Joseph Buddha Monry, had helped as a getaway driver during the robbery. Monry struggled with drug addiction and had already been arrested twice since the heist. Each time federal agents questioned him, Monry insisted he knew nothing, but Burke did not trust someone who might talk under pressure. On May 16, 1979, Monry's body was discovered in a dumpster in Brooklyn. Again, investigators believed Burke was involved, but they had no solid proof. Within 5 months of the Lufthansa robbery, 6 people connected to the operation were gone. Parnell Stacks Edwards, Martin Krugman, Richard Eaton, Teresa Ferrara, Tommy DeSimone, and Joseph Buddha Monry. Burke was removing anyone who could link him to the robbery. But there was one person he could not silence. Louis Werner, the airport employee who had helped plan the robbery, was arrested in February 1979, and his arrest would eventually change everything. Federal investigators eventually traced airport security records from the night of the robbery. The logs showed that a Lufthansa cargo employee, Louis Werner, had opened the access door used during the heist. When agents questioned him, Werner eventually confessed. He admitted helping the crew by providing information and access to the terminal. Werner also gave investigators several names connected to the robbery, but one name he refused to mention was Jimmy Burke. Werner feared Burke more than prison. In 1979, Werner was convicted for his role in the robbery and sentenced to 15 years. He served his time and was released in 1991. Remarkably, he was the only person ever convicted in connection with the Lufthansa robbery. The stolen money and jewelry were never recovered. To understand why Burke was so feared, it helps to understand how he operated differently from most organized crime figures. Many Mafia members followed strict rules. They needed permission from powerful bosses before taking serious action. There was a clear chain of command, and decisions usually moved through that structure. Burke operated outside those rules. Because he was not Italian, he could never officially become a made member of the Mafia, but that also meant he was not tied to its traditions. He didn't have to ask permission. He didn't wait for approval. If Burke believed someone was a threat, he dealt with the problem immediately. That independence made him extremely valuable to powerful crime families, but it also made him unpredictable.
Even Paul Vario, the man who had brought Burke into the organization, reportedly kept his distance. According to later testimony from Henry Hill, Vario once warned that Burke was useful but dangerous. Once Burke believed someone had become a problem, there was usually no turning back. Vario relied on Burke because he generated enormous profits, but Burke was not someone you trusted with sensitive information. He was someone you used when necessary. After the Lufthansa robbery, Burke began expanding into other illegal ventures. One of the most notable was a scheme involving college basketball games. Burke and Henry Hill worked with several players from Boston College, paying them to influence the final score of games without necessarily losing them. The goal was simple: win bets placed against the official point spread. Between late 1978 and early 1979, Burke reportedly made hundreds of thousands of dollars from this operation. But the plan eventually collapsed. While investigating the Lufthansa robbery, federal agents discovered the sports manipulation scheme. In 1980, prosecutors charged Burke, Henry Hill, and Paul Vario in connection with the case. Facing the possibility of life in prison, Henry Hill chose to cooperate with authorities. His testimony changed everything. Hill provided detailed information about the group's activities, names, locations, financial operations, and several violent crimes connected to the crew. In 1982, Burke was convicted of conspiracy related to the Boston College gambling scandal and received a 12-year federal sentence. While he was serving that sentence, prosecutors brought new charges against him related to the killing of Richard Eaton. Once again, Henry Hill testified. In 1985, Burke was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. That conviction ensured he would never walk free again. Burke spent the rest of his life at Wend Correctional Facility in Alden, New York. Even while in prison, his reputation remained powerful. Reports suggested he continued influencing